Tonight on PrimeTime Politics, a city under siege.
Police were reporting that they did not have enough resources.
Why did Ottawa declare a state of emergency in response to convoy protesters? And what did the province say to the city's call for help? We'll get the latest from the Public Order Emergency Commission and get some analysis from a former Ottawa police chief. Also,
I felt trapped and helpless.
Trapped and feeling targeted. We'll hear from local residents who appeared before the public inquiry. And
will this government admit they've let corporate greed go unchecked?
Are grocery chains profiteering from the high cost of groceries? We'll speak to the NDP MP who wants the issue examined by Parliament. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. The public inquiry into Prime Minister Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act began its first full week of testimony today. Now, its purpose is not only to determine if the invocation was justified, but also to understand the circumstances that led the government to use the act for the first time in Canadian history. More than 20 interested parties have been granted standing in the Public Order Emergency Commission, and today began with the city manager for the City of Ottawa. For more, let's go to CPAC's Andrew Thompson. He's covering the story for us. So Andrew, good to see you. Talk to us about the city manager. What did we hear from him? In particular, the declaration of emergency for the City of Ottawa.
Right, Michael, that is Steve Kanlakis, and he was facing a lot of questions about that state of emergency. And what we learned about that state of emergency was the city declared this on February the 6th before the province did the same, before the federal government did the same, essentially to act as a trigger for those levels of government to do more, to provide more help to the City of Ottawa. So we heard many exchanges on that. Here's one example of Steve Kanlakis with the Commission Council discussing the timing of that emergency declaration.
And so from the city's perspective, did it consider that the province wasn't doing enough to be engaged in the issues and to help resolve it?
Well, I wouldn't characterize it as that. I would characterize it the province, clearly through the Solicitor General, felt that this is a law enforcement matter that could be dealt with through existing authorities that law enforcement have, and that the police should be working together to deal with the resources and what they need under their existing powers to resolve this. That was the initial feedback we received from them.
And Michael, also of note with that testimony from the city manager, Steve Kanlakis, discussing why the city didn't just simply tow away these trucks and vehicles when they first arrived at the beginning of the shutdown. His reply was that that kind of towing operation was simply a non-starter, that just wasn't going to be possible given the security situation in downtown Ottawa, and that actually taking hesitant towing companies to court would have taken quite a long time in terms of the legal process playing out.
Mm-hmm. So learning about the towing companies, how the city was viewing that, also very interestingly to your point about the declaration really asking for more help from both levels of government, in particular the province. So that was one part of today. The other part had to do with the Ottawa Mayor's Chief of Staff, who also appeared before the Commission. Talk to us about what stood out in that testimony.
Right, this is Serge Arpan, and he was asked a lot of questions about that contentious decision by Mayor Jim Watson that he announced to allow vehicles and trucks to move from residential areas of downtown Ottawa to Wellington Street, right in front of Parliament Hill. Arpan was taking through emails and text messages about that decision and about federal concern with that agreement, especially concern from the Parliamentary Protective Service about what that kind of agreement would mean for their security situation. So have a listen to how the Mayor's Chief of Staff defended those negotiations with convoy leaders.
Yes, he was looking for any solution that might help us alleviate the pressure on our residents and what they were going through. And for us, it appeared that there was no downside for us to undertake this dialogue, as there was no end in sight. There appeared to be no, cogent, multi-jurisdictional plan to bring this thing to an end. And so, if we were able to get one truck out of the residential district, it would be a small victory. That wasn't our goal, of course, but the intent was to alleviate the pressure short term.
Now, as I said, Andrew, this is the beginning of the first full week of testimony. We've now heard from the city manager as well as the chief of staff to the mayor. Some interesting points coming out of there. Talk to us about the days ahead here. What else can we expect in this week?
Well, tomorrow we're expecting to hear from the Ottawa mayor himself, Jim Watson, so certainly expect more questions about that high-level political response from the City of Ottawa to the convoy, and also his communication with both the provincial government and the federal government as events unfolded. And then subsequently this week, we are going to hear from police, from the Ottawa Police and the Ontario Provincial Police. Now, Ontario Premier Doug Ford was in Ottawa today, but that was for an announcement with the Prime Minister, not here at the inquiry. And Doug Ford said that he had not been invited to testify.
Andrew, thank you for that. CPAC's Andrew Thompson. Charles Bordeleau was Ottawa's chief of police from 2012 to 2019. He joins us right now to share his thoughts on the protests and the commission's work so far. Chief Bordeleau, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
Listen, I wanted to begin with your thoughts on the testimony that we heard today. As you know, the city manager, Steve Kanellakos, was speaking. The city, it seems, when declaring that state of emergency, from what we heard today, it seems that really what Ottawa was looking for was more provincial action, which Ontario seemed hesitant to do. What's your reaction to that? Should Ontario have done more to the declaration of emergency?
Well, I think to start off with is these types of commissions are set up to really lift the veil, connect the dots, and get the full story. So we're getting the story in piecemeal, so we don't have access to all the information. But clearly, there's a message that's being sent by the city that when you have governments at all three levels aligned, things could go a lot smoother. And what this is about is about the city and the police service getting access to tools and resources to get the job done. So they were looking everywhere and anywhere in order to give them access to more tools to do enforcement. So if you look at the province, they have access to CVORs, which is the trucking regulations, MTO around closure of roads, the highways. So I think those are the things that the city and the police service were looking to the province to see how can you help us resolve this situation in a peaceful manner without having to send a bunch of police officers in and have a riot on our hands.
And what's interesting about that is that here we have this commission. It's looking not so much into Ontario's actions in particular, but on the Emergencies Act declaration, whether or not it was necessary. But given what we heard today from the city manager, do you think the act would have been invoked if Ontario had, for example, been more aggressive with revoking insurance or commercial licenses, or, as you say, closing down highways and roads under their control?
Well, we won't know that because we don't know what kind of effect it would have had on the truckers had their insurance or their CVRs been suspended. So we'll never know the outcome of that, but it was potentially, could have been used potentially as a threat or as a tool, as a carrot to say, if you don't leave, your CVR is going to be suspended and your insurance is going to be adversely impacted. So the province wasn't able to do that, but what the federal act was able to do, it did a number of things. It turned off the financial tap immediately to cease any more finances going to the convoy protesters. It gave police services in the city access to immediate resources. You heard the city manager talk about their inability to get access to tow trucks and the police services inability to get tow trucks. So the federal act gave them those tools. It also gave the authority for police to prevent anybody who wanted to come to this illegal demonstration or occupation to come to the city. That is something that the police service didn't have the legal authority to do prior to the Emergencies Act being invoked. And it also acted potentially as a deterrent for others to come to Ottawa to gather more steam around the long weekend. So those are things that the Act gave police and the municipalities more tools to do to help stop this. Now, whether or not it was right to be able to do that, to invoke the Act, that's what the inquiry will be able to determine, hopefully.
What they are looking into right now. But, you know, the province did seem to believe at the time, and again, from what we've heard from the city manager, they seem to believe that Ottawa police have the resources needed to actually deal with what was happening on the ground. What do you make of that assessment and that kind of response even now?
Well, the province's statement, from what we are hearing so far, is that this is the policing solution, and that police services should have been able to resolve this alone amongst themselves, dealing with getting resources from other police services. What we heard from Chief Slowly, that clearly resources were an issue, and for some reason or another, the resources were not coming. So I'm hoping to hear the story behind why those resources weren't coming. What were the dynamics between Chief Slowly and other police leaders? Why was there a delay in getting access to resources come to Ottawa to support the police service in Ottawa? So I think there's a story behind that hopefully will be told in order for the public to understand better what were those dynamics that were going on around getting access in a more timely manner, police officers to come to Ottawa.
So that is something that we'll be watching for. But again, and you hinted at a bit in your second answer there, but this commission really is looking at the Emergencies Act, the invocation, whether or not it was necessary. Based on your experience as a former chief of police, do you think it was necessary at the time?
I believe that it gave them some valuable tools in order to get the job done. Shutting off the tap to the convoy protesters and financing the operations was a key element that stopped that money from flowing. Giving police officers access to tow trucks and getting providers to be forced to come into Ottawa and bring their tow trucks, that was another element. And also giving that authority to police officers to stop vehicles. I think had those authorities not been granted to police, I believe that the convoy would have gone on even longer, and it would have been more difficult for police services to stop it. So it wasn't the only solution, but it was part of the solution that helped bring matters to a conclusion.
You hinted to the kind of answers that we're still looking for out of this inquiry, and I'm wondering, because we are expecting to hear from the Mayor of Ottawa, Jim Watson, and the former police chief as well in the coming days. What do you want to know from them? What questions would you ask them?
Well, I think the mayor will be more of his discussions with the province and the federal government and the behind the scenes issues. I think we heard a lot of what was going on behind the scenes from Mr. Kanalakis, the city manager. So I don't know what else we'll hear from the mayor's office. I think what I'd like to hear from Chief Slowly and other police services is, they thought that these protesters are only going to stay for the weekend. Obviously, they were wrong. Why were they wrong? What intelligence systems did they have in place to gather information? And were they the right systems? Did his board play a role in interfering in operations of the chief with respect to what they were doing and what they were saying? And were there dynamics with other police leaders that prevented resources from coming to Ottawa sooner to help them? And I think that those are the types of things that I'm looking forward to hearing from Chief Slowly and other police leaders that will come to testify.
Charles Bordeleau, always good to speak with you. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
So as we heard from Andrew, we will be keeping an eye on the inquiry this week as more local officials will be testifying. But last week, it was not local officials, but local residents who got the chance to tell the commission what it was like to live through the protest. Take a listen.
There was a certain chaos on the streets, and that feeling of chaos and rule breaking and law breaking gradually increased as things progressed.
And it was such an experience of helplessness, especially during the event, where the horn blowing was so loud and continuous. There was absolutely no place for me to go in my own unit. There's just no escape to that. So I felt trapped and helpless.
Well, Paul Champ is the lawyer representing Centretown residents and businesses at the public inquiry. Mr. Champ, thank you for joining us again.
Nice to speak with you, Michael.
Now, from the outset, you said that your purpose was to get the stories out there, to ensure what people in Centretown endured was actually stated for the public record. Why is that important for you?
Well, it's because there's so much misinformation and misperception out there about how serious the impact was on the people in downtown Ottawa in businesses. You know, we heard even more evidence today about how paramedics were having difficulty getting downtown, home care services, bridges were closed. It was just a terrible situation for the people in Ottawa, and they were trapped in their own homes.
It's interesting you say that, though, because I did speak to one lawyer for the protesters who said that if someone chooses to live in downtown Ottawa near Parliament Hill, protest is something they need to expect. What do you say to that?
Well, he's completely right on that. In terms of where you live, if you are living, close to the Parliament buildings, you do need to expect some interference and inconvenience at times with your life, and Ottawa has that all the time. You know, the people who live in downtown Ottawa, I think, are largely, very proud that they live in the nation's capital and host, different protests and demonstrations and the exercise of fundamental freedoms. But there is a limit where those rights and freedoms become abused, and it's not reasonable to have 100 to 120 decibel truck horns going 24 hours a day. It's not reasonable to have people shoot fireworks off your window. It's not reasonable to have all buses and paratranspo and all other services shut down for weeks at a time. It's completely and totally unreasonable and intolerable. And I'm surprised that the protesters, now that they've got a bit of hindsight, aren't realizing the real harm that they had on Ottawa.
Mm-hmm. Well, to build on that, we did, just before we came to you, hear from two of your clients, one of whom was Victoria de la Ronde. Mm-hmm. And from her testimony, talk to us about what made the protest so hard for her.
Well, as you have heard, Ms. de la Ronde is visually impaired. So she experienced, another level of helplessness and interference with her daily life. Trying to step out the door was very difficult in so many ways. With the loud horns, she often, uses sound to direct herself. She couldn't do that because the city couldn't do snow removal. The streets were slippery. There's the other issues of harassment of people jumping in front of her while she was walking and, asking her about her mask and so forth. But those were, the issues. And as well, the diesel fumes, pardon me. She was particularly vulnerable to the diesel fumes. And where she was located, she was at a particularly high concentration area of the trucks. And the diesel fumes were so significant in her home that when the protest was over, she had to get all her drapes and bedding all cleaned and carpets because they smelled of diesel. Like it was unbelievable what people in Ottawa had to endure.
Mm-hmm. And beyond the carpets too, she also talked about having ongoing physical issues because of the protest. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, indeed. Ms. de la Ronde, as I said, she's visually impaired, but now her hearing is also has experienced harm. She has tinnitus, like a low ringing in her ears, and she's also experienced hearing loss. She's got appointments with doctors to see if that's ever corrected, but she's concerned at her age that this hearing loss is going to be permanent. It's just terrible. It was a total assault on the people of Ottawa, and she's not alone. I can tell you I've spoken with many, many other people in downtown Ottawa who've experienced tinnitus and hearing loss, and I think in the months to come, we're going to hear a lot more about, how many people did experience those physical harms.
Mm-hmm. And physical harms, the lasting impact of the protest. But I also want to talk about Zexi Lee because, as people may remember her name, she is the Centretown residents who filed a court action against the protesters, in particular the constant blaring of the horns. And she was harassed as a result. Does that continue to this day, Mr. Champ?
Well, the intense harassment, online harassment and otherwise, subsided after the protests or demonstrations was over. But it was difficult even for her testifying. There was a number of people yelling at her when she came out of the building after her testifying here at the Library and Archives Canada, calling her a commie or asking her was she a Chinese government agent. It was just outrageous. And even down the block, it was just good citizens of Ottawa who intervened blocked and stopped some of the people who were harassing or walking down the street. We just have a breakdown completely in civility and basic respect for each other in Canada right now. I'm kind of speechless, really.
Now, of course, the Commission will be issuing a final report, and ultimately it will be about the use of the Emergencies Act. But I'm wondering what you hope is actually included in that report as well, because it seems that you are less occupied about the invocation of the Act. I don't know if that's fair to say. So, but if it's not about the invocation, what is it that you're looking for out of this final report?
Well, I think the evidence that we're hearing, as I see it, is that if the invocation of the Emergency Act was necessary, it was, because of 3 weeks of, confusion and lack of coordination between different levels of government. We're hearing very clearly from the city manager of Ottawa that they absolutely needed additional resources, that the Ottawa Police Service, once the initial tactical mistake was made of all these commercial trucks being able to come to downtown Ottawa, they were simply unable to remove them, and they needed additional resources. Well, then why did it take so long for the province of Ontario and the federal government to provide those additional resources? So I think that in the end, in this Commission of Inquiry, we're looking for some recommendations in future that recognize that Ottawa is the site of protest. It is the site of demonstrations. We are going to see that in future, and it's great that we are. I mean, this is, again, Ottawa is the place where people should come to be heard and to have their voices heard by Parliament, and to exercise their freedoms of association and freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. But we definitely need, I think, some recommendations where there's different structures or other things set up where the city and the provincial government and ultimately the federal government can work together more closely in events like this in future.
Paul Champ, thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Michael.
And do stay with us as we bring you ongoing coverage of the Commission's work. Parliament will be looking into the high cost of groceries, and it's all thanks to an NDP motion that got unanimous consent in the House today. Take a look.
I declare the motion carried.
Alistair MacGregor is the man responsible for that motion. He is the NDP Member of Parliament for the riding of Cowichan, Malahat, Langford in British Columbia. And as you can see, he joins us right now. Mr. MacGregor, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon to you.
So I guess congratulations are in order. A unanimous consent of the House. Were you expecting that?
I was not, and it was a huge surprise, a very welcome surprise. This is the first Opposition Day motion that's ever stood in my name. And it was really nice to see that all political parties in the House today recognized how important this issue is. I'm sure they've been getting a lot of phone calls and emails from their constituents. And I think it really helps fortify our message, demonstrating to our constituents that we're taking this issue seriously and that the corporate sector really needs to up its game and respond with effective measures.
So what do you exactly want to happen here? Because you're talking about the cost of groceries right now, of course, much higher at this point than it was a year ago to this date. So what exactly are you looking to happen here?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the tail end of the motion, it's really asking the House of Commons to support the motion that was passed at the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. Again, another motion in my name that was passed unanimously. And I think it's really just trying to identify the fact that, if you look at the cost of food in the sector, the fact that so many Canadians are struggling week in, week out in making those choices when they go shopping. And then when you compare that with the profits that we're seeing among the grocery chains, but also like with other things, because last year we learned that Canada's biggest corporations got away with paying $30 billion less in tax than they should have. So I think there's a fairness issue at play here. And again, I think it's just a demonstration that politicians are listening to their constituents, that we take this issue seriously. It's a non-binding motion, but it puts the spotlight and it puts political and public pressure on the government and the corporate sector to follow through.
Okay, to follow through, but we did hear today, for example, from the chairman of Loblaw, and he talked about the costs and acknowledged that Canadians are paying more right now for groceries. But he also said that this is very much a reflection of supply chains, that suppliers are having to pay for things like more expensive gas, the cost of production, and that's why things are more expensive now in the grocery store. As this gets underway, don't you already have the answers? Is this anything more really than political spectacle?
No, I disagree with that. And now I will agree with him that supply chain issues are there for all to see. We know that there have been an increase in fuel prices, the cost of labor has gone up, and even just the unavailability of filling positions in various processing and producer-oriented industries. But if you look at the profits that the grocery chains, especially the biggest three, have made during this time, and you compare that with the fact that many food items are rising above and beyond the general inflationary trend that we see in Canada, there's a mismatch here. And I think it does call for a parliamentary inquiry. That's why I think all colleagues, not only on the committee, but in the House of Commons, agreed with what we're pushing forward. They see some truth in the matter. They see a need to investigate this to really demonstrate that we are doing our due diligence and investigating. So I think there's more than meets the eye here. And I think it's time that we brought representatives of the big grocery chains before a committee to explain themselves on the public record.
Okay, I think though on the flip side of it, we certainly know the pain of when Canadian corporations fail and don't do well. Here we have cases where Canadian corporations are doing well. They're in fact making a profit. And as a result, they are employing people. Is it wrong to be successful? Doesn't this almost put a punishment on grocery store chains for being successful in a time when really companies are struggling?
Well, I measure success in how their employees are treated and paid. And you may recall that, during the pandemic, the groceries chains came out with a hero's pay, right? They topped up their workers' wages to recognize the extreme hardship that they were going through. Now, in what I think is a callous move, they took that away from workers. And these are the men and women who are really the face of the organization. I think a company's value comes from its employees. So if you truly want to demonstrate a company's value, I think you really need to step up to the plate and pay your employees what they're worth and make sure that their workplace conditions are adequate and safe. And I think that, there are questions in that respect as well. If you look at the wording of my motion at the Agriculture Committee, we're not only going to be asking the CEOs to come before our committee, but we also want representatives of labor unions for the workers that are in those industries. We also want economists who specialize in the grocery and supply chains. And also we want to hear from producers and processors who have their own quarrel with grocery chains, which is why there has been so much conversation on a grocer's code of conduct, which is really targeting the unfair business practices that many of them have been practicing vis-a-vis producers and processors.
I have about 30 seconds here, Mr. MacGregor. Where does it go from here? What type of timeline are you looking at?
Well, at the Agriculture Committee, I think it's a huge win to have the House affirm its support for this unanimously. It definitely puts the pressure on the grocery sector to step up to the plate. But going forward, in the weeks ahead, we will be starting our investigation into this as soon as we've cleaned up our study into Bill C-234. And I'm very much looking forward to that investigation getting underway.
Alistair MacGregor, thank you for being here, and congratulations on your motion getting unanimous consent.
Very much appreciated, Michael. Thanks for your interest.
That is the program for tonight. On behalf of the whole team here at CPAC, thank you for watching. I'm Michael Serapio. We'll see you again tomorrow.